Welcome, and thanks very much for joining us today. There's a lot going on out there at the moment, and you'll see I've called this Learning to Fly, because for once, South Africa's actually in a good place. But we're not used to all of this good news. The thing is that what we really don't want to do is fly for a year like last year, and then another year, this year probably also be good, and then collapse again. That is going to be our challenges now that we're flying, to try and maintain the altitude going forward. But let's kick off with the Americans, one of our major trading partners. The Americans are in decent economic shape. They're going to grow at about 2.5% this year, ahead of most developed markets. The US consumer remains strong, and the US consumer is going to get artificially boosted by Trump, because he's going to drop interest rates. He's going to bring them tax cuts as well to get them excited before the midterm elections. Trump needs interest rates low for debt repayments as well. The Americans pay about $1 trillion per annum on their $38 trillion of debt. What's happening at the Fed? You would have seen the Fed all over the news. Well, Trump has been nasty to the gentleman in the right-hand corner, Jerome Powell, the head of the US Federal Reserve. Now, in order to understand what politicizing the Fed means, the last time it was politicized was back in the 70s, when a gentleman by the name of Arthur Burns was head of the US Federal Reserve. He did basically what Nixon wanted. So he dropped interest rates just before elections, and that led to double-digit inflation, still today known as the Great Inflation. Now, Trump is furious with Powell because he hasn't been bringing interest rates down on demand, so he's now criminally blaming him for the refurb cost overruns on the Federal Reserve headquarters. This alienates long-time American allies and long-time investors, and it gives further wind to the Sell America trade. These are the last three heads of the US Federal Reserve. They came out with a statement last week saying this is how monetary policy happens in emerging markets with weak institutions, with highly negative consequences for inflation. It has no place, they said, in the US. Our greatest strength is the rule of law. And they are quite right. That is why people put their money in US assets, because they trust the institutions and they trust the rule of law. If that changes, it can have very negative consequences for US assets. Look at the dollar. It wasn't just us that strengthened against the dollar last year. There we are, top four from the top, but you can see everyone basically had a reasonably good run against the dollar last year, and expect that to continue this year. The dollar had its worst year in 10 years last year, for a variety of different reasons. Also, if he pushes interest rates artificially low, it affects confidence in the dollar. So expect another bearish year from the dollar this year, but probably less so than last year. There's a new head of the Fed coming. Jerome Powell's term ends at the end of May. Kevin Warsh is now being tipped, and as you can see from this, he has the necessary experience, so he's a good choice. He's Trump's nominee. He still has to get through Congress. He's been part of the US Federal Reserve Board before, from 2008 to 2013, during the global financial collapse. His challenge is going to be trying to persuade people that he is independent, given that he is a Republican economist. And comments like this from Trump last week, saying that he can stoke the economy to grow at 15%, isn't going to help him prove his independence. Turning to geopolitics, you would have seen Greenland all over the press a lot. Now, this is an artificially generated picture. If I showed it to you, it wouldn't really mean anything, but this came up on Trump's Truth Social page. Now, if, as he had been doing, he'd been threatening them, saying that he's going to take them whether they like it or not, and then he puts this up, it gives the people in Greenland anxiety. What did he really want with Greenland? He said he needs it for security. Now, his argument was that the Danish people would be unable to defend it in the event of attack. He mocked Danish security, saying that the security boost would be one more dog sled. Apparently, the Danish were not amused by that. What does he really want? He wants massive rare earth deposits in Greenland, because he wants to reduce America's dependence on China for rare earths, which are going to be the future. Also, when the ice starts melting up at the top, the shipping routes from the US will be shortened significantly. So the variety of strategic reasons he wants it, but also he wants to block China and Russia from having it. But the problem he's finding is that when he gets involved in geopolitics, his disapproval ratings, the red line here, goes up and his approval goes down. So geopolitics aren't going to win him any elections, and he has elections coming at the end of the year. So what this shows you is that the one thing that Americans care about most, more than half of them, for the last 4 or 5 years, is the cost of living, and that's what he's going to have to address this year. A recent survey from Yale University saying that tariffs from last year are going to add an extra burden of between $1,900 and $4,700 to each U.S. household. People argue, yes, but the stock markets have gone up and that will seduce voters. No, it won't, because most Americans are not experiencing benefits from it. There is a K-shaped recovery going on, which means some Americans are getting wealthier and others not. The top 10% wealthiest Americans own between 87 and 94% of all stock and mutual funds. The top 1% owns roughly 50% of stock market wealth. The bottom 50%, 1% of stock market wealth. What will count in Trump's favor, as the Economist put on their front cover here, is that on the left you have the Republicans, well-trained, with a leader, and on the right, the Democrats still without a leader, and they're going to have to change that quite quickly. So the Americans in a good space. The Europeans economically in a good space. Significant defense spend coming, 800 billion euros over the next 5 years. Inflation's under control. Bit of fiscal strain in France and Germany. They're going to have to raise taxes, cut government spending, but the euro looking good and European equities attractively priced. But what's interesting is that Europe and India announced last week the mother of all trade deals. They're basically going to drop all tariffs between the two countries, which is going to create a 2 billion people free trade area, which is going to double European exports to India over the next 6 years. Canada's done the same, UK doing the same with India and China. So what Trump has inadvertently done by alienating the traditional allies, the traditional investors in America, is he's forced them into the arms of the BRICS, who've just been standing there with their arms wide open. Looking at Russia, Ukraine, quite amazing that this is still going on 5 years long. The problem the Ukrainians face is that people are losing interest. Trump is losing interest. The Europeans have got war fatigue going on. Ukraine won't win. There'll have to be a negotiated settlement, and it will involve territorial concessions. In the Ukraine's benefit, frozen Russian assets are now helping fund Ukraine in their war against Russia, and also India is going to stop buying Russian oil, and that to a large extent has been funding the war in Russia. Leading up until Davos, this is how people really thought that Trump saw the world, basically just dividing it up between powerful nations. Countries with cards, he said, get a seat at the table. Sovereignty is a privilege, he said, not a guarantee. Now, when you think like that, it's basically game on for the big, powerful countries, because then they can each decide what they need and take what they want. So, for instance, Trump, if he helps the EU with Ukraine, then Denmark must give Greenland to the US. In such a world, it's a matter of time before Putin's aggression stretches beyond Ukraine. China takes Taiwan, and what if somebody wanted us at the bottom tip of Africa? So they went in to Davos with the Europeans, the Canadians, the Brits, all very, very nervous. But they obviously had a conversation behind closed doors. And then Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, came out and he said the following. He said the rules-based order is fading. The strong can do what they want and the weak must suffer what they must. Our view is the middle powers must act together, because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. Great powers, he said, have the market size, the military, and the leverage to dictate terms. Middle powers do not. If you negotiate separately with the dominating power, we negotiate from weakness. We accept what's offered. We compete with each other to be the most accommodating. And that was what was happening. We therefore have a choice, he said. Compete with each other for favor or combine to create a third path with impact. And suddenly at Davos, they drew in the line in the sand. They said Greenland is not available because they actually do have power. Could countries weaponize their US Treasury holdings? Yes, they could. You can see here the blue is the Europeans. If they decided that they weren't going to buy anymore or fund the Americans anymore, it would be a problem. And they suddenly realized their power. So what happened with Greenland in the end? They stood up to Trump at Davos. He threatened all sorts of punishment. That didn't come. Greenland remains Danish. Trump gets full priority access to Greenland, which according to a lot of analysts is all he wanted in the first price, and the rest, all the threatening was just the art of the deal. But the problem is it nearly caused World War III in the process. Looking at the UK, another big trading partner of ours, not in great shape at the moment. Fiscal strain continues. Keir Starmer has gone from the biggest election victory this century in 2024 to being the most unpopular Prime Minister ever in 2025, and even worse this year. But equities, half the price of the Americans, and a variety of initiatives that are going to bring growth. They too have done a big trade deal with India and with China. But certainly in this environment where big is better, because of Brexit, Britain feeling a little isolated and drifting closer to Europe. The Chinese, interestingly, thriving despite the tariffs. Look what China went through last year. They started last year in February with a 10% tariff. In March, it went up to 20%. In April, it went up to 34%. Then later in April, it went up to 104%. Then later to 145%. October, 30%, where it has stayed up until now. Despite all of that, they had a record trade surplus because they diverted their exports to Southeast Asia, South America, and Africa. Bitcoin, also all over the press at the moment. I'll say what I have said before about Bitcoin. There is no doubt that having a crypto-friendly president in the White House has helped. He's helped legitimize it. He's helped promote institutional buying. And I know that the idea of wealth creation without work is very appealing, particularly to younger generations. They're not happy with 10 or 12% per annum. They want 100%, preferably 200%. But as I always warn, tread carefully because it will be volatile. We are now 47% down from the October peak last year. So if you're going to buy it at current levels, you mustn't be surprised if it's down 25% in 3 months' time. It might be up 25%, but you've got to be cool with that level of volatility. Also, make sure it's stored safely and don't bet the farm. Speak to your financial advisor about whether A, you have the risk profile for it, or whether you can afford it. Okay, back to South Africa. Where are we? Now, it would really help if we stopped scoring own goals, because by the mid-January, we already one own goal down. What am I referring to? The BRICS war games. Did we really need to be involved in those? Do we even have sufficient military to go out and compete with China, India, Russia, etc.? Now, the Iranians were present. The president made a very clear directive that Iran was not to participate, because he knew that optically it wouldn't look good. In the same week, Iran was busy slaughtering people that were standing up in resistance, around 30,000 dead. Same week, the US Congress was voting on AGOA, whether or not to allow us to continue within the African Growth Opportunity Act. We squeaked through on that, by the way, all right? And I think the only reason we got squeaked through for another 12 months was because we went through in a basket of African countries, and I actually don't think Trump knew we were in that basket, okay? Trump's got a lot on his plate at the moment. Anyway, we're through for another year. That's good news, but our president knew, Ramaphosa knew it would be optically wrong for us to be playing war games with him at the same time. His request was ignored. Now, the idea of a rogue military is very scary, particularly in Africa, because that's how military coups happen. I don't know how scary, because I don't know how scary our military is at the moment. But in a world of where might is right, what if, as I said earlier, Russia or Iran decided that they wanted strategic foothold at the bottom of Africa with all our minerals? Got to think about that. How do we even know that Iran was taking place in the war games? A colleague of mine in Kumi wrote an excellent article recently where he said the following. He said, we know from the photos from the Simonstown Grannies, the same legendary binocular brigade that spotted the Russian ship Lady R in 2022, retired, restless, and perfectly positioned. He said they've become an informal branch of our national intelligence network. And boy, were they sending that photo to everyone, neighborhood watchers, everywhere they possibly could. And I'm going to take you back now quickly, just some negative news on where we have come from, because as I said, it's very important we don't forget where we've been from, where we've come from, as we go forward. We've got to make sure that doesn't happen again, because it's been brutal in this country. Justice Malala wrote this book in 2015. Excellent book, excellent title for a book, because at that stage we were well into the Zuma presidency. We were, as the president said in the State of the Nation address last week, he said we were in an era of decline, and the president is quite right. Our Treasury Department has been trying to arrest South Africa's deteriorating finances since the global financial collapse. I'm going to come back to our Treasury Department a bit later on. Why have our finances been deteriorating? State-owned enterprise bailouts, high civil servant wage bill, massive corruption. That saw us being successively downgraded further and further into junk. Coronavirus obviously worsened it. We had a decade of 0.8% growth on average, all due to mismanagement of the economy. We cannot allow that to happen again. As Nkumi, my colleague, wrote, and he puts it perfectly, he said, people did not sour on the ANC because of abstract debates about liberation memory. They moved because the promised better life never arrived in the tap, the clinic, the school, and the payslip. And I think he is completely right. Load-shedding, crime, collapsing infrastructure, and joblessness did what no opposition manifesto could. They turned unwavering loyalty into conditional support. And I think it's important to remember that as we go into local government elections. But for me, the scariest thing about South African politics is that the same people responsible for state capture, and Chief Justice Zondo spent 3.5 years of his life drilling into state capture with his committee, putting down in detail who did what when, okay? Those same people, many of them who are responsible for destroying our state-owned enterprises, our growth and our future, for putting us on the grey list, they are now coming back masquerading as legitimate politicians, and that should not be allowed. If you appear in the Zondo Commission 5 times, let's say, you should not be allowed to contest local government elections because many of them want another chance to do the same thing. So, when are local government elections? They're in November, between November and January, but probably in November. There are 540 parties, 100 new. That is also ridiculous. We need to trim that down. So expect a lot of political noise, expect animosity to rise significantly, but the analysts aren't too worried about that. They actually say it may be better for the country, the results that come out of that. Our Treasury Department believe they can get us back to investment grade by 2028. That is very exciting. But as Stuart Theobald wrote, there are many advantages to getting back to investment grade, but we're going to have to prove for once something that we haven't done before, that sound economic management survives political transition. That means whoever comes in after Ramaphosa at the end of next year, whoever comes in as head of the ANC, regardless of anything else, will continue the economic trajectory we're on, and there isn't a guarantee about that. So, look at what a year we had last year. And how many of you thought this time last year or 2 years ago that I was being way too optimistic? Look what actually happened. Bonds up 21%, the rand up 12% against the dollar, gold up 50%, the JSE up 42% in dollars. So a spectacular year. And 2026 looks set to deliver again. So as I said, we're learning how to fly. We got off the grey list, a massive effort between Treasury and the private sector working together. Growth up 1.2% probably for last year. This year will be about 1.5%. Not great, but certainly better than it has been. The ports are much improved. The railways have bottomed. They're heading in the right direction. The lights are staying on. Operation Vulindlela, fixing the country one piece at a time, doing an incredible job, but it would really help if we didn't break things in the first place. Everything they're fixing was broken, and if we could really stop doing that, it would make a big difference. In terms of our monetary authorities, be thankful for the fact that they are independent and always have been for the last 30 years. They do not take guidance from a political party in terms of what they do, and they are first world in terms of their behavior. Our debt to GDP stabilizing for the first time in 20 years. Massive tax revenue overrun as a result of the commodity boom. 40 billion rand extra than they were expecting. First major ratings upgrade in 16 years, so therefore a tax increase unlikely at the budget. Be very thankful. Our finances are in good hands. Also, a new head of the NPA, Andy Matibi replacing Shamila Batoy. There was a process, 6 candidates. They went back and said none of them were suitable. The president made a decision. It's a very good decision. He was head of the Special Investigations Unit. He's getting replaced by his chief operating officer. The two of them apparently will work very nicely together. This sends a very clear message, and it's a crucial position because if captured, the slow cancer of corruption will continue. What's driving gold? I mean, gold through $5,000. Gold likes rate cuts, it doesn't like peace. Now, you're going to get more rate cuts, and you've still got Trump in the White House, so peace across the world is unlikely. It also likes a devaluing US dollar. You're going to get more of that this year. Also, massive central bank diversification. They got a fright when they saw Russian assets being frozen, a lot of central banks, and they decided, hold on, we don't want our assets frozen if we have a fight with the Americans, so let's put it into something more tangible. So the gold fundamentals looking good. They could continue. Here you can see our inflation under control, starting to anchor towards the low point of 3%, probably 3 more rate cuts, each 25 basis points this year. So in summary then, what are our risks? Trump, but he's done more or less everything he can to us, but then he could cause chaos on the global stage. Local government election noise, as I said, there will be noise, but we're not too concerned about it. ANC Ramaphosa's succession noise, that'll continue for the next 2 years, and then government-owned goals. But hopefully with the government of national unity making decisions, we make less of those. But the good news is, despite all of those headwinds, despite the risks, for the first time in a very long time, the tailwinds look encouraging and will outweigh the risks. Gold, precious metal rally to continue, strong rand to continue, inflation to remain low, 2-3 more rate cuts somewhere around there, but growth probably a bit firmer. And despite doing 42% last year, the JSE remains cheap. So let me leave you with one thought, last thought. On the first week or 2 of April last year, after Liberation Day, the amount of phone calls we took from people saying they wanted to take money overseas, to just get money out of South Africa. That was after markets went down 30%, the rand down about 20-25%. That is not the time to do it. Now is the time to consider your offshore investments. When the rand is strong, when the news is good in South Africa, that is when you take money offshore. So thank you very much. I really hope you enjoyed that. Thank you very much for joining us today.